Hi everyone, welcome to BRICS Briefs. This is the second part of a two-part series about the BRICS Bank, or it's formerly known as the New Development Bank. We're going to run a short intro video and then we'll be back to start the discussion with our guests. Enjoy.
Promising alternative to Western-dominated financial entities, the BRICS Bank aims to foster development in emerging economies. However, it faces significant criticisms that cannot be overlooked. Despite its potential, the bank often falls short of its revolutionary promises. Critics argue that it is entangled in the very structures of financial imperialism it seeks to oppose, perpetuating existing inequities rather than dismantling them. Our guest, Professor Prof Bond from the University of Johannesburg, will provide an in-depth analysis of the bank's operations and management. His insights presented at the World Social Forum 2024 and the Committee for the Abolition of Illegitimate Debt events highlight several pressing issues. The BRICS Bank, while a commendable initiative, faces significant challenges. One major criticism is failure to advance a meaningful de-dollarization agenda. Despite promises to reduce dependency on the US dollar, a substantial portion of the bank's transactions still rely on it. This reliance undermines the bank's goal of promoting financial sovereignty among BRICS nations. Governance and transparency are other critical areas of concern. Critics, including Professor Bond, argue that the BRICS Bank suffers from poor management, slow disbursement of funds, and a lack of transparency in its operations. These issues are compounded by internal conflicts among member countries, which further hinder the bank's effectiveness. Bond is also very sensitive to issues related to green policies to combat climate change, to which he devotes ample space in his critical analysis. Indeed, according to Bond, despite rhetorical support for green projects, the BRICS Bank's actual contributions to combating climate change are minimal. This discrepancy reflects a larger pattern within the bank, where lofty promises often do not translate into concrete action. Professor Bond's analysis suggests that the BRICS Bank may be more aligned with global financial norms than it is with its founding principles of promoting an alternative to Western-dominated financial systems. This alignment raises questions about the bank's role in perpetuating rather than challenging financial imperialism. As we get into these tough topics, we know that this conversation might make some people uncomfortable and provoke strong reactions. But our aim isn't to sensationalize or exploit discontent. We strive to foster an informed and educated public capable of critically analyzing international financial and political dynamics with courage and integrity. Join us in this enlightening conversation with Professor Prof Bond as we examine the complexities and contradictions of the BRICS New Development Bank. Together, we will explore the path towards a more equitable and just global financial system. Stay tuned for experts' critical view. Professor Bond on the flaws of BRICS Bank.
There we go. All right. Veteran journalist and statesman Rhod Mackenzie from SCOBRICSinsight.com is here. Hi, Rhod.
Hi, Clive. Good to be here.
Excellent. Thanks for coming. Always great to have you. Make sure to subscribe to Rhod's YouTube channel. It's at SCOBRICSinsight for more great content. All right, we have a special guest, Professor Prof Bond. Welcome, Patrick.
It's great to be with you. I'm here in Johannesburg, South Africa, and would love to stay more in touch with your discussions. It's wonderful to be part of them now.
Oh, excellent. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. Patrick is a distinguished professor of sociology, a political economist, a political ecologist, and scholar of social mobilization. We are talking to Professor Bond about his view on the NDB and its role in BRICS. So I'm just going to bring up I just want to show this. So if we go to that, this is your bio, so people can look. If they want to know more about Professor Bond, you can go to this page and the links will be in the description below, and you can read about it. It has a lot of books, a lot of material. obviously as a professor, he's got to. So if you see here, accredited journal articles, scholarly books, there's a lot, and I definitely encourage you to have a look. Also, this is the article that our producer highlighted, and that Professor Bond. And there was a video, you'll see here, there's a video, and I encourage you to listen to that. So I just wanted to highlight that before we continue. All right, so we'll keep going. So yeah, thanks again, Patrick. So on that article, there was the concept of sub-imperialism, which was a very interesting way you've termed that. And you described the NDB as engaging in sub-imperialism. Can you elaborate on what you mean by this term and how it applies to the NDB?
I'd be happy to, Clive. And I'm just going to take a moment of personal reflection, because I think it's very important to say, politically, where do you stand? What are your interests? So in my case, it would be based on an education, although I was born in Ireland, an education in the US, and that included the Wharton School of Finance. And you might know two more famous graduates, Donald Trump, about 10 years before me, and Elon Musk, our Johannesburg-born native, a few years after me. And what they were taught and what I was taught was financial imperialism. And at the same time, I was working at the US Federal Reserve. I had to pay back my student debt and got a job of encouraging banks to invest in inner city communities. And my boss then, on and off from 1981 to 85, was named Paul Volcker. And I often will attribute the perils of international financial relationships, not only to the IMF and World Bank, for Africa, for Latin America, for poor countries in Asia. In the early 80s, the term third world debt crisis came from Paul Volcker having jacked up the interest rate by, at one point, it was up to 8% in real terms, so above the inflation rate, above zero. And that was a time when most countries, the big countries in Latin America, from Argentina and Mexico to Brazil, and here in South Africa, they went bankrupt. It wasn't the same sort of bankruptcy that we've seen, say, from Russia in 1998 or even in 2022 because of the squeeze. But those were impressions that I've kept with me. And those impressions help you hate the US Federal Reserve and hate financial imperialism, because you see the sort of trickle down of their policies to the poorest countries. And that means when financial imperialism, which is really the core of world monetary, currency, and financial management, with major commercial banks and other private institutions, the big institutional investors in New York and London, in Frankfurt and Paris and Tokyo. And on top of that, a sort of quasi-global regulatory system. As I mentioned, the IMF, the World Bank, the Bank for International Settlements, and then the network called SWIFT that at least enables for much of the world, although not Russia, not Iran for a while, the financial transactions. Now, the reason we desperately need to get beyond financial imperialism would, in my view, stem from mismanagement of that power over the dollar that the Fed has enjoyed. And frankly, it was South Africans in 1944 who went to New Hampshire, a hotel, Mount Washington, a place called Bretton Woods. And that was where the Bretton Woods system, not just the IMF, the World Bank, and later what became the WTO, where they came from. But it was also the deal that was done with the dollar as a grounding, not a gold standard per se, but a fix of $35 would buy you an ounce of gold and vice versa to stabilize world monetary, financial, and currency transactions. And one of the key negotiators, John Maynard Keynes, really wanted, let me say, a more balanced approach that would penalize countries if they were contributing to economic instability. For example, if they had a big trade surplus. And what I found extraordinary, particularly because at that time, 1944, nearly half the world's gold was underneath where I am now, Johannesburg. And the other half was in also about 1,000 meters deep in Fort Knox, Kentucky. So the Yankees had their half the gold because they'd centralized it all during World War II in 1944, they were the great creditor nation and controlled the above ground gold, and South Africa had to blow. So they came together to say, well, let's throw out John Maynard Keynes' wonderful ideas and make dollar hegemony. So I think we start with that, Clive, that's the system, especially with the Federal Reserve at the switch points where they can run more money as a quantitative easing. They print more money. They can do that through, in a sense, buying commercial banks treasury bills and then circulating that money, they hope, through the economy to stimulate it. And that was first really done in a big way in 2009 to try to get out of the world financial crisis. Similar sorts of techniques include lowering the interest rates artificially and then deregulating and letting banks do all sorts of things that from the 1930s they had been prohibited because they were making such a mess. The 1930s, the Great Depression, and the whole financial collapse, the US and many other places, reflected excessive deregulation and excessive financial power. And now, again, in the 90s and early 2000s, the Fed began to allow, and with the Glass-Steagall Act and with the geographical financial deregulation, they allowed these banks to get out of control. And I think that would be my most important motivation. And I hope for everyone else, they're aware of just how much this dollar hegemony can do to run inflationary tendencies in the financial markets by quantitative easing on the one hand, and as you saw from early 2022, raise the interest rate, or when I was working in the Fed under Paul Volcker, raise it to acutely damaging levels. And of course, we've got debt crises bubbling up all over the world and makes the Belt and Road Initiative very, very difficult to continue with because of the infrastructure debt. And in all these ways, I think we desperately need a de-dollarization and new institutions not under the thumb of the West, because they clearly again and again show malevolence, power used in geopolitical ways, as you pointed out, but also they use, let's say, a financially loose system that benefits their financial institutions. And that's really to the detriment of all the rest of us. So we have to de-dollarize and we have to find new institutions. The question is, have we got the seeds of those now growing within the BRICS? I think not, because too many times sub-imperial finance, which means my friends here in Johannesburg, in the Sandton Johannesburg Stock Exchange, in Rosebank, where the banks have headquarters, they are westward gazing. And the dilemma has been that when last August we hosted the BRICS summit here, the head of the BRICS Business Council allowed our main banker, his name's Sim Chabalala, the bank is Standard Bank, 20% of it owned by China, but they unfortunately allowed these guys to set up the committee to say, we don't want to de-dollarize. It will hurt our own financial relationships with the credit rating agencies and international banks, and we don't want to move in that direction and alienate Western financial power. That's why I could call them, to sum up, a sub-imperial, not an anti-imperial sort of financial project.
Right. I think that's been the biggest part of the problem, Patrick, is the fact that certain elements, I mean, it was here in Russia, we had it right the way through until they cut off from SWIFT in 2022. As in, well, let's not alienate ourselves from the West and the institutions, etc., and de-dollarize and whatever. You know, I mean, although Russia did start de-dollarizing back in 2014 after the first set of sanctions, but they still continue to allow their commodities to be priced in dollars and to go along with the system. It's only when they finally hit them smack between the eyes like a pole axe that they thought, well, hang on a minute, why are we going along with these fraudsters? Why are we allowing these fraudsters to dominate and take over? I mean, since Russia decided it didn't want to play those stupid games, it's only continued to prosper. I mean, I did an article which is on my website that you'll find interesting, Patrick, that the World Bank actually announced that Russia had become the fourth largest economy in the world in 2021.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the dilemma, as you say, is that there had been a group of financiers, including your central bank head, who unfortunately put $650 billion worth of hard currency in European banks, especially. And so one of the dilemmas, one of the things that this dollar power, and the Treasury Secretary in the US activated that at the very beginning of March in 2022, was simply asset theft from Russians, including the oligarchs, but also the central bank. And that would be one of the motivations. Iran has had that sort of problem. Venezuela, many countries that fall foul of Western geopolitics find suddenly the currency and financial and monetary relationships are also weapons of war. That's part of this sort of big hybrid war. And I think the dilemma is when the BRICS come in, and they should be the alternative. We were most surprised, and I'll be frank, disgusted that the BRICS Bank agreed with Western financial sanctions. Now, whether or not one needs to put sanctions on Russia, or you need to pay back for damage done in Ukraine, we could leave that question. But the main point is that the BRICS Bank, which was at the time 19.5% owned by Russia, put sanctions on Russia, March 4, 2022. And so did the...
That, Patrick, is absolutely shocking. And my opinion on that is Russia should have said, well, hang on a minute. We're either part of this or we're not. Either you're with us as part of the BRICS and we're going to stand together, or you go and just become a small branch of the IMF and bugger off, to be honest.
Well, in fact, we can even identify, Rhod, what the thought process, and I interviewed one of the senior vice presidents at the BRICS Bank recently to confirm this. And the tragedy is that the gaze of the BRICS Bank, which is in this lovely new Shanghai building, it's not a gaze towards Moscow or New Delhi or Pretoria or Brasilia. It's a gaze towards New York. And the reason is that there are 3 companies in New York that seem to have extraordinary power. And those are Standard & Poor's, Fitch, and Moody's. And my confirmed impression, at least early on, but then confirmed in this interview, is that somehow or other, keeping that AA credit rating for the BRICS Bank is more important than the 20% ownership of Russia. And what they do when they do investor meetings is to basically say, we've only got 6% of our assets in Russia, so we're safe. But they still got downgraded in spite of putting on sanctions and putting on investor roadshows.
That's absolutely laughable when you look at Standard & Poor's, Moody's, etc. In the subprime crisis. These people were giving AAA credit rating to buckets of horse manure, right?
That's true.
And selling it as AAA rated investments. I wouldn't trust any rating by the Standard & Poor's, Moody's, or whatever. And I've actually worked with them. I had Russia Financial News back in the 1990s, and they used to take my information and analysis for putting together their own ratings, you know. And to be honest, they were clueless, and they basically give you a rating if you pay them. See, this is the thing that really got me, is every company actually pays them for rating them. So, you know, are they going to give you a terrible rating? Very unlikely, unless you're practically bankrupt. I mean, it's very unlikely. They're not trustworthy, but unfortunately, it's all about reputation. As in, these 3 are allegedly sort of unbiased, and we'll give that. But we only have to look at the what happened in subprime, for example. That was the classic.
Yeah, that's right. Lehman Brothers and AIG, as I recall, both got, was it AAA, or they at least got AA? Just as absolutely. So it was farcical. And what also strikes me when I see the visits by, and they have offices as well, but when their key people visit, they are absolutely locked into 1980s, 90s Washington consensus. Their view of what an economy must do is so, let's say, old-fashioned. It's based on purely having a high interest rate that will create, in real terms, flows of money into the financial system from abroad. And then fiscal discipline so that the private sector is not crowded out. And the dilemma is, in South Africa particularly, but in you know, some of the other BRICS, I would even add China now, is that you can have lots of funds available for bank lending. But if you've got overproduction, if you've got a vast set of ghost cities because your property market is bubbled up, or in our case, you've got a huge excess capacity of manufacturing because we've been deindustrialized, well, the banks have nowhere to go except into financial markets. So that's one of the most crucial questions, especially when we're still dealing with a BRICS Bank that is dollar reliance. 77% of BRICS assets and liabilities are dollar or euro denominated. And the huge challenge to get out of that dollar addiction requires a BRICS bank that has a bigger agenda. Their ambition is only to get to 30% instead of currently 23% local currency.
Well, it should be certainly more than 70% in the next 5 years, because that's exactly if you look at the proportion of the trade between Russia and China, it's 90% either in yuan or in rubles. With India, but Russia, its trade with its neighbors, even within Europe, is 50% in rubles.
Yeah. Now the dilemma, if you do a ruble and rupee swap, say you're selling your Russian oil and gas, on the Indian side, then you've basically locked up a lot of that money because there's a huge trade imbalance. And only now, I think, with military sales, are they beginning to address that. And that comes to the question that was asked in the insert, which is, do we really need a dollar to mediate between a ruble and a rupee? Now, if there's a trade imbalance, you do need something that's sort of an honest broker, a currency that everyone will accept, a gold standard of sorts.
That's where you can use the Middle East, where you look at Dubai with the dirhams, or Saudi Arabia. All countries trade with United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, certainly within the BRICS. So if you've got an excess of rupees, pay Saudi Arabia with the rupees, and vice versa. I mean,
yes, you can work them out.
Patrick, do you remember the European monetary system back in the early 90s, which is the forerunner of this financial system? That worked between the Deutschmark, the franc, and sterling, which were the three main currencies that worked. It worked exceptionally well, right? I mean,
the dilemma is always, do you have a currency within that? And obviously it would be China that strengthens, obviously the Indian rupee strengthening as well. Whereas your other three currencies over the past 15 years, not just because of the current geopolitics, but they've been declining within the original 5 BRICS. The rand has declined dramatically. The real from Brazil has been through ups and downs, but mostly downs. And the same for the ruble. Now, if you don't have a trade balance, it's relatively even, and you can see the especially Chinese manufactured goods still coming in. We need to buy them. Well, what can China buy back? And of course, that reinforces the old neo-colonial relationships in which South Africa basically sends right now coal, gold, platinum, manganese, and iron ore to China, and we get finished products back. And that will be the next set of dilemmas. And the dilemma for a BRICS bank, can't you do anything to balance things out so that this trade doesn't take on those features? And there I would say we do need more of the local currency lending for the sorts of things like infrastructure and productive activity that don't necessarily require imports. And here we're talking about some of the things that are falling apart as I speak. Right outside the potholes on my road in central Johannesburg, right? The water system isn't working nearly every night, no water.
The energy system as well, the energy grid really needs a lot of attention.
And those are mostly, not all, but mostly local currency. That's why I would stress, Rhod and Clive, that the dilemma for a BRICS bank is that they're going to the Standard & Poor's, Fitch and Moody's for a high credit rating. And it's because they're wanting to have a AA so that they can issue bonds. They can go to any stock market in the world and say, hey, we're AA, we're AAA. Then they get a slightly lower interest rate and they can pass that on. But they still then have to get from you, the borrower, hard currency. And that means your country has to have an export surplus above its imports. And if instead we had a local currency-based lending system, we wouldn't have that pressure to export. And moreover, it would be a better fit between the kinds of investments that we need that are, my water pipes here in Johannesburg, or much of our electricity grid can be built with our local materials, but especially labor. Our costs of labor, which really a BRICS bank should be mopping up all of the unemployment. It's 42% right now. And that would be
Patrick, I agree with you entirely on the fact of the obsession with the Western finance. I mean, you only have to look at the IMF and to see that the new development bank's following the same mistakes. I mean, the IMF lends in dollars and gets paid its interest in dollars. So the country that's actually borrowed in dollars, which actually had been given the funding in its own currency, it could pay it back in its own currency, it wouldn't have the serious problems with the devaluation of its currency. Right? So, I mean, the biggest problem countries like Argentina have is because its currency depreciates, its interest bill goes up. So it has to sell more of its own currency for a less value just to pay its interest bill.
And we're seeing defaults all over in this continent. We've always had Zimbabwe defaulting for the past 24 years, but also Ghana and Zambia, and a few months ago, Ethiopia. Now, these were star performers in the 2010s, and they were exporting.
Well, that's down to the fact that they have to pay back in dollars, right? And basically it cripples their economy because they've borrowed in dollars and their currency is depreciated and they still have to keep up the payments.
And I might add that the big question for managing the BRICS will be whether Ethiopia joins them, because Ethiopia is a full-fledged new BRICS member, part of the BRICS 10, the BRICS Plus. And the dilemma is that just after the choice of Ethiopia and Egypt as the African members, along with United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Iran coming from West Asia, Argentina was chosen just on the edge of bankruptcy, but then a right-wing government pulls out of the BRICS. So you have these 5 new members, one of which Egypt, well, 2, UAE and Egypt, were already members of the BRICS Bank, but I don't think Ethiopia will be allowed. And it brings us, Rhod, to what you were saying about the IMF. I was disappointed again by a sub-imperial bloc of BRICS leaders who say, when there's a chance to replace the head of the IMF, her name, Kristalina Georgieva, she's coming out of the World Bank, she's a neoliberal Bulgarian economist, and her record is one of squeezing these poor countries. So a chance to sweep her out and put in somebody who's not, as you say, a European citizen. In the case of the World Bank, a US citizen. That was a man called Ajay Banga, born in India, but fully assimilated into US finance as the head of MasterCard last year. So here we've had 2 chances to clear out the leadership of the IMF and the World Bank and have a popular vote and to have a veto power with more than 15% of the vote now. But the BRICS delegates who go to the IMF are some of the worst conservative economists. And not only did they unanimously support her, they're also been negotiating to give the IMF and World Bank more money. And the last time that chance came up, it was in 2015. It's very revealing. China, India, Russia, Brazil gave lots more money. In China's case, a 37% increase. In India's case, a 23%. Brazil 11, Russia 8. South Africa fell 21. In other words, the voting shares changed dramatically towards BRIC, not the S for South Africa. We are kind of broke. Now, what that meant is that instead of a democratizing process within the IMF, the rich countries, Europe and the US, they conceded a little bit, but the real losers in terms of the voting share were the poorer countries, the 2 that lost the most. Nigeria, 41%, Venezuela, 41%, even South Africa lost 21%. What that means is that the BRIC countries were sort of standing, putting their foot on the heads of these poorer countries, pushing them down so that the BRICS would have a higher voting share. But then, as I say, they don't do anything with it. They don't change policies. They don't change lending terms. They don't even change the top management. And I think it's that self-satisfied assimilation or sub-imperial relationship that some of these BRICS government officials, the delegates from the Treasury, from the central bank, that are part of it.
It's just an old boys club and those who are in members of it. I mean, to be honest, I don't think I know anybody that takes the IMF actually seriously. I mean,
well, we do. Unfortunately, I must tell you, Rhod, I'm suffering. My students at University of Johannesburg are being squeezed because the IMF made a $4.3 billion loan to South Africa with a ridiculous loan. It shouldn't have happened during COVID. And now the austerity is hitting everything, including the higher education sector. Now, I should add at this point, we really had hoped that a contingent reserve arrangement, CRA, would sweep out the IMF for those practical purposes of emergency loans. If we needed that 4.3 billion, we could have got it from a contingent reserve arrangement. But you know, that thing has never existed. In 2014, it was announced. 2015, it was founded. There's $100 billion notionally of our foreign exchange reserves from the 5 BRICS countries. For South Africa, it's $10 billion. For the 3 middle BRICS, it's I think 18 billion, and for China, it's 41 billion. So notionally, there's a lot of money in a contingent reserve arrangement fund, but it has not been activated.
That goes back to my point I made earlier about why does the BRICS need the IMF when they could actually pool their capital together and throw it. I mean, as I said, in 2014, just after or just prior to the Maidan coup in the Ukraine in 2014, Russia just lobbed 3 billion in hard cash to the Ukrainians.
When it was the pro-Russian government, Yanukovych, I recall. Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So there's nothing to stop sort of Xi and Putin getting together with Modi and Lula, saying, okay, guys, let's pony up $1 billion each and help our pals in South Africa get over this crisis at reasonable terms.
I know I would have had a much different approach to the BRICS, much more friendly than I do now, if that had happened. And instead, you might know that this contingent reserve arrangement is being managed by these very neoliberal central bankers. And so if they say, look, South Africa, you need that 4.3 billion. Actually, we're only going to give you 3 billion now. You have a $10 billion quota, but you only get 30% up front. The other 70%, we can give that to you later as a loan, only if you go to the IMF first and you get a structural adjustment program. That's written into the Articles of Agreement. So it's a shocking reflection that instead of being the alternative to the IMF, this contingent reserve arrangement is in fact an amplifier. It gives them more leverage because the IMF says, oh, now we're going to lend a little bit of money and give a contingent structural adjustment loan. And that is amplified because it's the incentive for the next 70%.
Well, I think there's certainly the finance ministers of Russia, India, and China, along with Brazil, really need to get together and start sorting out these liberals that are obviously enemies of the aims and objectives of BRICS. I mean,
yes, I think that
cuckoo. I mean, they're obviously not on board with what the aims and objectives of BRICS are, and are basically a subsidiary little brother and of the IMF. I mean, following its draconian type of policies that have failed miserably the whole third world, Latin America, etc. I mean, can anybody point to me out, and Patrick is an economist, I'm an economist too, can anybody point to me a success story of the IMF? When it's intervened in a country, when has it actually done something positive? Had a positive outcome?
It's been disgusting. Yeah, it has. And actually, this is a question from the viewer I wanted to put up, because my question, because this was while we premiered, Patrick, have you been in contact and consultation with the BRICS banking group? So this is a pretty relevant question to where we sort of leading out of the sub-imperialism topic.
Oh, yes, indeed. And in fact, if I can quickly answer that, Clive, it's over 4 years ago, I spent a week with the current president, Dilma Rousseff. She was the former Brazilian head of state. So some of those discussions, which were really about climate and environmental lending and the rights of future generations, stick with me because I could tell she had the greatest intentions. And of course, the US was, you could say, to some extent, encouraging Michel Temer, who had once been a sort of If you believe the WikiLeaks State Department cables, which I think we do, there's a little bit of a linkage there. Dilma was clear to me when I said, did the US push you out in 2016? Was Washington behind your impeachment? She said, no, it's local factors. But we did very much say, look, the need for factoring in to any bank how they will lend so that the future generations are not burdened first with debt and second with the decline in both the extractive industries, we call it natural capital. In other words, the non-renewable resources that are being depleted on the one hand, and on the other, pollution. So climate change, especially greenhouse gas emissions that create the extreme weather that we've been seeing. I mean, Siberia having such terrible fires a couple of years ago. Here in South Africa, we have very, very serious problems with rain bombs, where you get 350 millimeters of rain that fall in.
Patrick, we had the coldest May in the time I've been in Russia, and that's 33 years. It was absolutely freezing in May. So talk about global warming, no.
No, well, I'd say extreme weather, wouldn't you? Because certainly extreme heat.
Extreme weather. We didn't have a warm winter, I can assure you. We had the -40 as usual. And it was
okay, well, I don't want to be there
in May, which is unusual here.
We had a 0-degree cold winter day today. That's as cold as it ever gets here in Johannesburg. So you'll want to join us next November, December. But I think, to be serious, Dilma certainly convinced me that there was a desire. But then you see, she visited Moscow in July last year and couldn't change her institutions' policies, which lock Russia out of borrowing. Secondly, I met just at the end of December a senior vice president of the BRICS Bank, and we had a couple of hours discussion. His name, Leslie Mastrup, and he ends his tenure there after 8 years at the end of this month. A very brilliant man who I'd worked with closely writing policy for President Mandela's government. And I think I was confirmed in my worries that instead of really being an alternative, let me tell you what I would have liked to have heard from BRICS Bank officials and from Dilma. Sure. I would have liked to have heard Hugo Chavez's Bank of the South, the Banco do Sur, as the model. Local currency lending, the ALBA network, which included Nicaragua, Bolivia, Ecuador, and 1 point Uruguay, and certainly around Venezuela. And they asked a dear friend of mine called Pedro Paez, who's the former Minister of Economics in Ecuador, to help to design this Banco do Sur. But as he has openly argued, and as Paulo Batista from Brasilia, he was one of the key figures of BRICS Bank vice president, as he explained, the Brazilian central bank was so full of neoliberals, they didn't want to see their development bank, BNDES, having the sort of competition from Hugo Chavez Banco do Sur. So we had a model, and when Chavez died in 2013, that ran out of steam. Let me mention Paulo Batista, because if you want to really, for the listener, to check in, especially on how a real insider in the BRICS Bank sees its problems, the Valdai Club hosted. Pepe Escobar brought this to our attention. Pepe is a great journalist who's very pro-BRICS. We have a lot of differences of opinion, but what Pepe showed was that when he spoke early October last year to the Valdai Club, what Paulo Batista, the former vice president of the BRICS New Development Bank and a former IMF delegate from Brasilia, and very clearly an anti-imperialist, but he then went through all of the problems that he witnessed in the BRICS Bank. And I think that would be what you would want to do, to search out, will this institution, even with a great leader like Dilma Rousseff, with good people at the top like Leslie Mastrup, will they actually be able to change tack? Now, in Leslie's case, he had come from Citibank and Barclays. He was involved in privatizing education, but he's a great mensch, any South African coming out of the liberation struggle has got good values. But I don't think even Leslie could make a case that the BRICS Bank is any different than the World Bank. And I say that it may be worse because the World Bank's been beat up by community groups and environmentalists and trade unions for about 40 years, since the mid-80s. That process has only just begun to make the BRICS Bank a little bit more responsive. So the BRICS Bank loans here I've done a survey of about 11 of the loans, all of the loans, and they do tend to go to corrupt borrowers who do ecologically destructive lending that is very expensive, because even though the BRICS Bank is a little below what the market rate would be if we borrowed, we're borrowing at about 12.5% interest rate, the fourth highest in the world. Russia's above us, so is Brazil, so is Pakistan and Turkey. So we're about fifth highest in the world. 12.5% borrowing for our sovereign loans. It's very expensive. It means, again, as our currency goes down, the real effective interest rate is ridiculously high. And the BRICS Bank does give you a couple, but it's not enough.
Not development level rates. I mean, if we're talking long-term development rates, we should be looking at 1%, 2%, 3%.
And I mean, because Clive, so much of what we're going to need to do as extreme weather hits, okay, whether or not it's a real phenomenon in Rhod's point of view, I think it is. Climate change is doing damage to our infrastructure. You'd have to admit that sea level rise is happening, and the extent to which we're going to need to rebuild port cities, strengthen ports. Our rain needs stormwater drainage now and pumping stations, and those are very expensive. Our rural areas, terrible droughts in Africa that have swept through. So we're going to need some boreholes and pumping systems and irrigation systems to avoid mass starvation. These are the sorts of things, infrastructure, investment, and lending are absolutely required. But because people are so poor, they can't afford anything like that sort of an interest rate. The market rates of return are...
I hear what you're saying, but until you actually change the people who are involved in running the New Development Bank, nothing's going to change. I mean, what you need is a complete change of the type of people who are in there. Get rid of these liberals, because all they do is procrastinate and go along with the status quo. Right?
No, I'm with you.
The club. What you want is somebody who's a bit radical, who says, right, I've had enough of this. It's never worked. It's never going to work. Now let's do it differently.
Yeah, I even vote for John Maynard Keynes. We can be radical.
Yeah, look at Navalny, the Russian central bank, right? I mean, she's basically rewritten the rules of what central banks should do to manage the currency, manage the interest rates, and manage the economy. Right.
Well, 2 points there. I mean, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump in any way, but he did actually show in 2020 that even a Trump could authorize massive fiscal expenditure to save the U.S. economy. So the fiscal side, which is giving ordinary people money.
It was the way it was done was actually ridiculous. This helicopter money was just throwing money at the wall and see if any of it stuck. I mean, Russia did a lot less of it and had a better result than the amount of money that was thrown at it.
Yeah, but you needed desperately, with those emergency lockdowns, you needed to get money to ordinary people to spur economic growth from below.
Patrick, I'm sorry, but you've worked with the Federal Reserve now. I've listened to a number of people from the Federal Reserve. They actually used to be a client of mine at Russia Financial News back in the 1990s, right? But when I hear Janet Yellen, I just cannot stop laughing. I mean, this is the woman who told us 3 years ago that inflation was transitory, right? Yep. I mean, transitory, you know, she goes on and I mean, we are going to destroy Russia's economy. No, you're destroying your own economy, you stupid old bag. I mean, what the hell is she still allowed to pontificate on subjects she has absolutely no understanding of?
Well, I think like most economists, she's as well trained as anyone. She would probably come with a Keynesian story, that is, that the pumping of money into the economy, if it goes to ordinary people, can do some good. What they screwed up on, as you say, was inflation. And if I understand correctly, the inflationary tendencies have come from a couple of spurs from mid-2020 after the lockdown shocks. One was commodities, which helped South Africa, helped Brazil. Certainly the commodity price increases helped Russia, especially after 2022 with the energy price increases. That seemed to have ended by about June, July 2022, and those prices have come down. So did inflation. The other was corporate price fixing. So there was a degree to which, very good economists, I'm thinking of the Center for Economic Policy Research and Dean Baker in the US, really can show that the drive of inflation had come from big corporates. Now, the other factor is that when you pump so much money into the economy and you don't really have a place for it to go in new investment, it goes into financial assets. And that's the extraordinary inflation, isn't it? That is so parasitical and damaging. We have a name for it. I'm sure you remember this, Rhod. Maybe Clive, if you've done the financial investment. It's called a Buffett indicator. Warren Buffett, right? The great investor who said, well, you might not like him, and I don't either, but the point is he can say, look, I put my money where you get a relatively low Buffett indicator. And that means your market capitalization to GDP. If the market capitalization is too high, then we won't put it there. And that's the thing to watch. You can look at it.
If you look at what's the inflation and in the US, petrol, or gasoline as they call it in the States, is up 40%. Food prices are up 30%, and housing costs are up 50%. Right? So, you know, that was not down to price gouging. I mean, obviously, food costs are more expensive because animal feed's gone up, or costs have gone up, etc. Energy costs have gone up. I don't actually understand why, if the US is self-sufficient in energy production, natural gas, etc., why their energy bills are so high. I mean,
well, and you saw how that affected geopolitics. Not only the blowing up by, it looked like CIA of the pipeline Nord Stream, but also what we're seeing on the screen now, which is the degree to which we can replace fossil fuels with solar. And this is a very interesting investment by the BRICS New Development Bank. The dilemma comes back to what, Clive, you were saying. If that interest rate is at the same sorts of levels, 12% in international terms, which we have to pay with a declining rand, meaning we probably are paying closer to 20% once the depreciation, what we would call the real effective interest rate. Now, when that happens, I know I put 6 solar panels on my house here in Johannesburg, getting fed up with the load shedding, the ESCOM chopping us off. And that cost about $8,000, which I could kind of manage as an upper middle class academic. But wow, there are very few families that can do what's being suggested, that is, at market rates of return, replace their fossil fuel dependency with solar. And that's where we're going to need grants. And I would raise for the BRICS, because I think it is crucial, Rhod, whether you're on board or not with the shift away from fossil fuels. It is crucial that the what's called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Conference of the Parties, was held in a new BRICS member last year and in another new BRICS member the year before, in Dubai and in Sharm el-Sheikh, in UAE and in Egypt. And the dilemma is, again, I'm going to make a case that instead of being an anti-imperialist bloc that can really grapple with climate change and demand that the West pay its climate debt, something that we hear from South Africans pretty regularly. But of course, BRICS also has a very large climate debt. And that means that the BRICS delegates who go to those UNFCCC COPs, the Conference of the Parties, every year, and this year it's going to be in Azerbaijan, the next year in Brazil, Lula will host it in Belém in the Amazon. But unfortunately, the relationships are such that the BRICS delegates that go there cohere more with the Western delegates because they're both high polluters and none of them want to pay a climate debt. I'll leave that there, because climate financing would be something I would hope a new development bank, a contingent reserve arrangement, and every bank in the world is conscious of, because this is a serious challenge. Cheap, solar.
I mean, that's sorry to cut you off, but I want to bring that up because, you know, why isn't the NDB engaged in green projects as much as they say they intend to? After all, they do have a 40% green project target. And I think you touched on this before, actually, Patrick, because you were saying, well, this is the sub-imperialism topic again, where they're more in trying to get AA rating, lower interest rate, appealing to the Western hegemony, financial hegemony. I mean, is it really just that? Should we rehash that, or is it?
No, I think it's
the culture, Clive. It's the people who are there and the culture. They're not any different from what their counterparts at the IMF, etc. It's another jobs for the boys, and they've basically set the thing up for the old Chums Act. You know, as I said about 10 minutes ago, what they need to do is fire the lot of them and put a whole new set in there with a full set of BRICS values and BRICS attitudes about can do, let's go, rather than, oh, well, we do, and let's have another meeting about it, and what did the IMF decide? Shall we copy their policies?
I'm with you entirely, Rhod, and I will just point out one wonderful economist, Prabhat Patnaik, who has retired. He's the professor emeritus from Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, and he said this just as the BRICS began. If you don't do something about the class structure of the way BRICS financiers and BRICS exporters and BRICS kind of business elites operate, you won't have a BRICS New Development Bank that will be any different. Now, the case is not just the westward gaze of our financial elites, but it's also, Clive, getting back to your question about whether the BRICS Bank will find borrowers who will do anything different. Let me give you one example that breaks my heart, and it's one that the Wagner Group also found that it broke not only their heart, but about 25 of their fighters went back to St. Petersburg in coffins. Northern Mozambique. You might know that the third largest gas field in Africa is in Cabo Delgado. And unfortunately, it's Total Energies and ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil seems to have a partner, China National Petroleum. But the tragedy is that the Development Bank of Southern Africa, along with Standard Bank, 20% Chinese-owned, has been a main financier. And that's where the BRICS New Development Bank has been lending. It's for methane gas. Methane is, regardless of your position on climate change, it is a fossil fuel that is 85 times more potent a greenhouse gas than is CO2. And so, to say we're going to transition out of coal, which South Africa's government is slowly doing, about 80% of the power in my laptop net right now is coming from coal-fired power plants, to gas, facilitated by the BRICS Bank. That's going to be a serious problem because it means we will have a new version of fossil fuels embedded in our exports. And so when we export to especially the West, which has a new carbon border adjustment mechanism, tariffs, taxes on imported goods that are made from fossil fuels embedded through their energy in the products, well, they get taxed and we won't be able to afford, in a sense, the correlating tax. Our products will become uncompetitive. It's in all these ways. I just don't think our BRICS Bank officials are really thinking through what it would be to be green. And ironically, it was Joe Stiglitz and Nick Stern, Stiglitz from New York, Stern from London, both former World Bank chief economists, who were asked by the BRICS Bank to put their original mission statement together. And I thought they did actually quite a good job. I'm critical of World Bank as much as anyone, but they did a fairly good job of saying, okay, you really do need to be a different bank, but it's just not. Unfortunately, it's still dollar denominated. It uses the global, let's say the Western financial system way too much. And that includes for the sanctions against Moscow. And then it's, as you say, I think, Rhod, I can't fight you. Its staff are, well, let me use Batista's words, lazy and incompetent. Just look at that Valdai speech that he made, the Valdai Club in October, and you'll see some shocking revelations of how the BRICS Bank is not really up to snuff.
Yeah, I mean, this is something, let me bring this up for Rhod to comment on first. How has the NDB's approach to Western financial sanctions, particularly against Russia, influenced its operation and reputation?
Well, as I covered that slightly earlier, it hasn't. I mean, it looks foolish. I mean, how good is 20% shareholder in Russia, and then bank says, well, we're not actually going to do anything with you because we're frightened of the reaction by the Western governments and the World Bank and the IMF. What they should have done was tell them to go forth and multiply. As in, we're going to carry on doing business the way that we want to do business with the countries that are members and are our shareholders. And if you don't like it, sanction us. I mean, what are you going to do? Your sanctions haven't had much effect on Russia, so what are you going to do to us? Cut us off from the financial markets? Well, we'll just raise money in Shanghai, we'll raise panda bonds in Shanghai, or we'll raise ruble-denominated bonds in Moscow, or rupee-denominated bonds in India. Come on.
Well, this is a dilemma. Until we get an alternative to the dollar, there is friction, right? If you don't have SWIFT, it becomes a one-on-one bilateral arrangement, and if you have a trade imbalance, Russia and India, then you might have problems. So we desperately need these the Kazan meeting to find some better way to work around, and it might be.
Sure, I agree with you, Patrick. But the question was, what should the BRICS Bank have done? New Development Bank done, and it should have told them to go forth and multiply.
Yeah, certainly there's no shortage of liquid financial assets for the BRICS Bank to raise its $20 billion from, if that's what they're looking for. I mean, you know, China's got vast flows of surplus. We do too. In Johannesburg, our, I'll use the term again, Buffett indicator, market capitalization of GDP, is 330%. We have plenty of liquid funds, and you don't need dollars to lend, to on-lend in dollars, but I think you're right. The mentality of many in the BRICS Bank is very constipated. They're very Western focused, and that comes really right from the outset. KV Kamath, who did have some rhetorical gestures towards local lending, but he had come from a major Indian bank, state bank, BC, I think it was called, and they privatized that. So yeah, I do think we're going to need, now that brings us maybe to the thorniest problem, which is geopolitical differences. And, you know, you've taken Iran and Saudi Arabia, and we thought just over a year ago, China was putting them together with China needing yuan-denominated purchases of petrol. So they had a big piece of Saudi Arabia, but they also seemed to start a rapprochement between these two crucial countries, which, you know, at each other's throats. It didn't turn out that way. We saw on April 13th, after Israel bombed the Syrian embassy that Iran was using, and several generals were killed. Well, Iran had to react. And what they did on April 13, I'm sure you'll recall, they sent 300 or so missiles and drones into particularly 2 Israeli military bases. Now, the configuration of defense was very revealing. So it was obviously UAE and Saudi Arabia that teamed up as Abraham Accord, well, Saudi Arabia trying to become a full-on partner of Israel, and UAE already, with the United States, Jordan. And so they stopped those, I think all but one were stopped. But also Russia, according to Cy Hirsch, gave permission to the US to do this. Now, this geopolitical problem, when I'm sitting here in Johannesburg, right after the election, which we're very nervous about, because it could be that the leader of our government, in order to stay in power, Cyril Ramaphosa, will do a deal with the center-right. If Cyril Ramaphosa does a deal with the left, because he only got 40%, terrible figure for our ruling party here, 40%, whereas last time, 57%, right? That huge drop. And in order to do a deal with the center-right, it means we won't, I'm guessing, have the same sort of solidarity with Palestine. And that presents a problem. I mean, only really Iran and South Africa, to some extent Brazil, have shown up as Palestine solidarity allies. And the other 7 BRICS really haven't done much, or in the case of Saudi Arabia and UAE and Egypt, have been actively sub-imperial US on the geopolitics. So we're looking at a fractured BRICS. It's fractured also on the India-China border, where there are fisticuffs that lead to deaths, and there's a huge construction military sort of buildup that's going on.
But the India-China thing's been going on for donkey's years, and it's just basically like 2 schoolgirls in the playground, sort of, you know.
But it could be fatal.
It's never going to get out of hand. It's handbags, basically 2 girls fighting with handbags, swinging at each other. It's been going on.
They're not allowed to use guns. I think I'd agree with your metaphor, perhaps, even though it's a bit sexist. But you're right; they're not allowed to use guns on the border. But I think what I'd say to you, Rhod, is it may seem like you know, tiny slivers of the Himalayan mountains, and these troops are, you know, fighting, throwing each other off. They're dying in the freezing rivers, falling off the mountains. It's just ridiculous, isn't it? But there's something bigger there, which is Kashmir, and that is the route that is particularly important for China from the west side to get access to the Indian Ocean and then through to the Persian Gulf.
That's happening with already. India is now working with Iran on the Bandadaras port, etc. China's already working with them.
No, I can promise you that
Russia's working with them through the north-south transit corridor, etc. It's all coming together. This is just girls fighting in the playground. I mean, it's
no. There's two problems. But if
I'm old enough to remember Russia and China arguing over small bits of the border in Chita in the 1960s, when they didn't even have diplomatic relations, right? And it was the same sort of thing. It's the press build it up to be some sort of major regional conflict, but again, it was just a minor skirmish.
No, let me jump in here, because let's bring it back to the NDB, because I want to make sure that, sorry, because no, don't get me wrong, it's gripping what you guys are talking about, but I do want to keep on the subject, because we'll have Patrick back. We'll have Patrick back, and we'll have a different format maybe, and he can present some other ideas, because we want this, right? But we're almost at an hour, so I just want to get this. I want to put this to you, particularly because we want to present this to the audience about the NDB, because there's issues, right? And I just asked about the sanctions, which led to the different conflicts, and that's absolutely an issue when we're talking about development. But let me, because we don't want to go too long after the hour, so let me just ask you on your personal insights and reflections, Patrick, before we sort of start to wind down a bit. Based on your extensive research and expertise, what are your personal insights and reflections on the potential of the NDB to foster genuine financial reform and equity?
Well, that's a great question, because under the current circumstances, Rhod's exactly right. The terrain in which you do lending is Western prepared, and that terrain is extremely uneven. And as we've talked about, things like the currency relationships and the export drive and the failure to find the right price, the grants and low interest loans, all of those things are very disappointing. But I think I'd even go further, that I will expect more BRICS countries, including Ethiopia, which started it, and maybe Brazil. It depends what's happening with their politics. But in 1987, Brazil went bankrupt. In 1985, South Africa went bankrupt. In 2022, Russia had a small set of defaults, and in 1998, a full default, if you recall, in the Yeltsin years. What these suggest is that we're not actually talking about, very, very reliable countries in the world division of labor. They go through their ups and downs. And as the BRICS expand, we're going to see many more of those quite shaky countries. And I think the orientation, what we talk about in our civil society meetings called BRICS from below, is often, well, how desperate are your people? Are they creating crises through their rioting, their protests? You've heard of an IMF riot. In this country, I think that's what our police force and our army even is worried about in one particular province, KwaZulu-Natal. The city there, you probably have heard of, Durban. And the reason is that the ex-president, Jacob Zuma, is potentially not happy with getting 15%, a remarkable figure, with a party that just was begun in December. But he has implicitly threatened what happened in 2021, mass riots, 350 dead, $5 billion worth of damage. Now, that's the sort of, let's say, social instability. If you have a repressive regime in Beijing or Moscow, you kind of clamp down, okay, put down the protesters. My dear friend Boris Kagarlitsky, an academic, in jail for 5 years. That's pretty tough. He just had a little Telegram tweet. But in Brazil and in India and in South Africa especially, there are serious signs of unrest. And Iranian women who can, do the feminist arguments a year and a half ago, or the Saudi democracy movement, as much as it's been suppressed. And all of these other potential, Egypt had an Arab Spring that got rid of Mubarak. I would say that's the last thing that a banker wants to see is his or her investments in countries and infrastructure now being threatened by the kind of social unrest that reflects, frankly, the BRICS still being part of a world economy that doesn't treat the poorest people at all well. That would be my final thought.
No,
I'm actually surprised with the IMF being based in Washington. It actually hasn't invested in infrastructure in the United States, because I don't know if you've been to the United States recently, but the infrastructure there is pretty bad. In fact, it's worse than it is in South Africa.
Well, that's hard, but I was actually in Oregon about 6 weeks ago, and I'm even a very strong and wealthy state like that had some serious problems with bridges, and especially, you know, as Rhod, the inability to do adaptation for the climate crisis, the wildfires sweeping through Oregon, the inability to get a water system in for drought areas.
The problems with the wildfires in Oregon is a lack of forest management. Right?
Well, and it's getting worse and worse.
You do the proper forest management, like get clearing of brush, etc., then you don't have these problems, right?
Well, let's agree that it's both and.
You've got all these green loonies that don't actually understand how to look after it. I mean, I grew up in the Northwest Highlands of Scotland, and you would burn off the heather. It was something that worked, right? And it regenerated the land, right? So, you know, if you look at I'm a lover of the land as much as anybody else, and I love the forests, and I grew up in the country. I grew up in the mountains in the Northwest Highlands of Scotland, right? So I know about the land. I'm not a townie, right? And I know about looking after the land and making sure that you take care of it, because it is a wonderful resource, right? But by having these ridiculous ideas that burning off the heather is somehow damaging, it shows a lack of knowledge.
Look, let me just jump in there, because in this particular point, which I should validate, because in Australia we had a very serious issue a few years ago. We had serious bushfires, very serious, killed a lot of people, a very large amount. The investigation later on found that it was because of lack of burning off. They did not manage the burn-offs and the removal of fuel in that area that caused a very disastrous fire, which would normally be nowhere near as bad. So that's what the investigation actually found. So I just wanted to say, you know, Rhod's putting that out there, and this was actually the findings, and that was another example in Australia. So
both ends, I think, in this case, good.
Yeah, because there's the other side too, as with you, Patrick, where there's an issue with pollution, right? There's a major issue. Now, I don't want to go too far, but I will say pollution is a major issue, right? But you're not talking about pollution only.
Well, two types: local pollution, right, that affects your immediate emissions and the damage done from especially toxics, but it's the land, the air, the water.
Yes.
But it's these greenhouse gases that I think they do threaten us all, and our next generations, Rhod, your kids and their kids, and you know they'll look back at us and say, well, what did you do? And I think the two parts of that generational justice, certainly that we talked about with Dilma Rousseff for a whole week in Sharjah in the UAE 5 years ago, that was an incredibly important moment to say, not only are we leaving kids with environment that is much worse off, but the materials, fossil fuels that we're currently burning could be used like all these other resources that are non-renewable for their needs. And those would include, for fossil fuels, the hydrocarbons for tarmac, for roads, the pharmaceutical products, my laptop, plastics and other essential synthetic materials, and lubricants. Now, if we use all our fossil fuels and our hydrocarbons and we burn them, it's absurd. I think that would be the point where I've tried to ask BRICS bankers, can you not think about the deep relationships?
Let's be straightforward here. Fossil fuels have lifted more people out of poverty than any other thing in the whole history of mankind.
I don't disagree. I don't disagree. The dilemma, and especially if you're coming from a cold and miserable island like Great Britain, and I was born in Belfast, so I'm same sense that I owe a lot to coal.
My second most favourite pub in the world is the Crown Liquor Saloon.
And yet, you'd also agree that if you pollute, you should pay. Polluter pays is that very basic phenomenon that if we can show that greenhouse gases are a global problem, the so-called loss and damage that results, the massive destruction of, say, Africa's development possibilities, those should be met by the the climate reparations, ecological debt that, when I fly around the world, like I flew to Portland, Oregon about 6 weeks ago, it was about 2 tons. Now, I think I owe something for that to my children and their children and on and on. And I think that's the next
stage. I recycle my potato peelings to the dacha.
Okay. Look, I think we could approach it a different way. I think the way that it's being approached now, and this is, to add to the discussion, Patrick, and you bring up a very good point, because the NDB is engaged in this. It's one of their primary, as I say, they're supposed to be targeted at 40% of their projects and green projects. I think it's a different way of approaching it. My suggestion would be that we actually develop our technology to a higher platform, because we know that fossil fuels, as you just mentioned, they could be probably better used, more efficiently used in producing the plastic type products. We should have the technology, but the way it's being approached is that we're actually
Are we still with Clive?
I cut out a bit.
Just a little break. Could you back up one sentence?
Yeah. I'll continue. So the way they're approaching it is that they're suppressing the technology. Instead of moving forward, we have a new platform of technology, and then we could approach it in a positive manner rather than a restrictive manner, because people object to this restrictive, suppressive manner. And I think if we approached it in an expansive, I think it would be received better as well.
Would you like the South African spin on diffusion of technology? It's come from 2 experiences, right? Out of my 62 million compatriots here, about 7 million are living with HIV. And about 25 years ago, a movement started from grassroots activists, Treatment Action Campaign, to say it can't only be the rich white guys, and often in the gay community, who get access to the medicines. Those were the US drugs, the antiretrovirals. It must be for everybody. And so they started a movement, and to get rid of intellectual property on technology at the World Trade Organization was incredibly difficult, but they did it. And Bill Gates was against it because, of course, my Microsoft program running here is giving him money because of IP, the intellectual property restrictions and copyrights and patents. And to get rid of that and do what you're suggesting, technology becomes a global public good. It's the thing I'm most proud of, that my compatriots were able, through their activism. Hey, our life expectancy went from 52 to 66 just before COVID. Now, we lost the same battle in COVID. In COVID times, there was a vaccine, whether or not you like the vaccines, maybe in the audience you'll have different views, but vaccines and treatment were very important to diffuse, and South Africa only got 35% coverage, and most of the continent got much less. And the reason was those greedy Canadians, like Pierre Trudeau, his people, they locked up 5 vaccine shots for every citizen, and we weren't anywhere near that. That was the Canadian, let me say, hypocrisy, their greed and selfishness. And that failure to get Yeah, but I'll just finish the sentence, Rhod, and then you fight me, which is that if you can diffuse the technology, including solar and electric vehicles and batteries. Now, the opposite is what the US, Janet Yellen, the finance minister, and Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, plus Emmanuel Macron, plus von der Leyen, the European Union leader, when they met Xi, all 4 of them met Xi last month, and they said, stop overproducing your electric vehicles and your solar panels and your batteries. It's too much for us because we want to have our own industries. And the rest of the world is saying, no, China, you're underproducing, produce more. We desperately need to get some of the new tech into circulation. And the problem is the price and intellectual property restrictions, even for the Sputnik vaccine, even for Sinovac and Sinopharm vaccines.
Patrick,
we couldn't get
it's just the hypocrisy again of the West. If we don't control it and we can't make money from it, then we're not having it.
That's right. It's a for-profit system that's going to ruin us.
That's the whole thing. It's America with its Microsoft, and if you look at Amazon, if you look at Google, etc. I look at Russia, where it has its own search engine, Yandex, as opposed to Google. Right? We've got VK, which is a Biconte, which is a far better social network system than Facebook. Telegram was developed by a Russian. Right? We've developed those alternatives simply because we were sick. Well, people here were actually clever. But in fact, if you look at Google, it was actually Sergey Brin, who was a Russian, who was one of the two founders of it. So, and Mark Zuckerberg actually stole the idea for Facebook from somebody else in college. But anyway, so I mean, basically, the whole thing about the energy, green energy and whatever, if the Americans are in the lead with the technology, it's fine. If anybody else is, well, we're going to stop here. It's like the microchips with Huawei and
it's true. The term we use in economics is kicking away the ladder. Once you've gotten industrialization, you don't let anybody copy you the way the US got industrialized, the way Britain got industrialized. So that sort of ability to control intellectual property, because you know that, Clive, if you go to most of our productive cities, and especially in the east coast of China, huge US corporate operations through subcontracting funnel vast profits to the US, even though it's the workers in China and it's the Chinese companies that are doing, or in the case of of Apple, it'll be a Foxconn, a Taiwanese company.
For example, Apple is an American company, but it doesn't actually make anything in America.
Yeah, it's an IP power, a research and development centralizing function, the marketing, all the nonsense that goes on in corporates that is the source of profit. And I think if we start the discussion about an hour and 12 minutes ago on the question of de-dollarization, we might even finish it here, because that's why de-dollarizing will be crucial to changing geopolitical power relations, so that a very parasitical economy like the United States and much of Western Europe, Germany may be accepted, but most of them are hollow corporations that are simply making the third world do the hard work. China as an intermediary grabbing cheap minerals from Africa, and the profits all go upwards to the corporate headquarters in New York. It's a shocking system. We need to change it, and de-dollarization or power to Russians who feel the same way and might be able to do something in Kazan, instead of the neoliberal corporate financiers that seem to be dominating inside the BRICS. So let's hope there's a change in power.
That's a good local point, and I wanted to bring that up, as the final thing, because we've gone a fair bit over, but it's fine because it's a gripping, I think, for me anyway. Hopefully the audience have appreciated. It's a great conversation. But I just wanted to bring it back to South Africa, the recent elections, South Africa and BRICS, and you're in South Africa, Patrick. So in the recent South African national elections, which have just recently concluded, the African National Congress, ANC, lost its parliamentary majority for the first time since 1994. So to form a government, the ANC may need to enter into a coalition with other parties like the Democratic Alliance, DA. Now, there was also another party, which was the MKP, which you mentioned before. And it seems like the MKP's approximate 15% voting share, election share, was what was taken away from the ANC. And there's talk about whether, because they have to make a coalition. The ANC has to make a coalition, and we're seeing, will it be with the DA, which is actually more their opposition, or potentially it could be with the MKP? And I want to get your thoughts on this and where it's sort of heading, and obviously its effect on BRICS.
I know the dilemma, as I had just hinted at, that if the ANC moves towards a DA, 40% ANC, 21% DA, Democratic Alliance, that means probably we end the kind of solidaristic social policy that we had with Palestine, and it would probably also tighten up the budget. And so the recent gifts that the ANC gave to get election, sort of support, such as a national health insurance, maybe decades in the making, or a basic income grant, and not much. Currently, it's about $20 a month, or even deregulation, decriminalization of marijuana, of ganja. Those were little gifts given to the left by the ANC, and I don't think the DA would allow those to at least be as generous. There will be probably a basic income grant acceptance. If, on the other hand, the ANC moves to either of the two next parties, number 3, Mkhonto weSizwe, MK party, that is Jacob Zuma, or even the number 4 party, which had been number 3, and it was getting around 10, 12%, and went down to about 9.5%. And that's the Economic Freedom Fighters, a fiery left-wing. Both of them, by the way, MK and EFF, are spin-offs or split-offs from the ANC. They were sort of repelled from the ANC, partly because of the corruption of former President Jacob Zuma. He was put into court processes and objected, and then quit the ANC, and in December quickly came up, and he won 45% of his home province. So they may be ruling in their home province, that is KwaZulu-Natal. I think you're exactly right. I wish I'd, in setting out scenarios in which the BRICS may be strengthened if MK or EFF are their partners, but South Africa may have a much more wobbly relationship with the BRICS if the DA, because the DA has said, well, the BRICS, we don't like them. Not from the left as I do, but from the right. So let's watch this space. It's about 13 days of negotiating before they make their final decision, and the government is put together. So join us again as we go through all of these strange permutations that are under discussion as we speak.
Oh yeah, no, that's good, because we're lucky to have you in this particular geographical instance, other than the rest of your extensive experience. But let's leave it there. We've gone well over. The producer's going to fire me. But I said, we're going to go along. And I really appreciate, Patrick, that you've come along. Rhod, you as well. You make this discussion. I think potentially we might get a little bit of a better feed with Patrick in some way. We get Rhod and Patrick, and we talk about these issues, right? And we actually talk to each other, and we disagree. And I mean, I would watch it, right? And we put forth, we come prepared, and we actually put things on the table. But I'm just saying, because it's obvious, but I think the audience enjoys this, because one of the things that's been really missing is the lack of conversation with the actual, like which you pointed out, Patrick, with the people on the ground, the poor and the middle class. And that's something that we actually need to take to the people to actually talk about. And frankly, it doesn't really happen. So anyway, I'll just put that out there. And again, thank you, Patrick. Please come back again. We'll talk after, and Rhod, of course, next week. But let's finish off, and thanks again.
Great. Yeah, and thank you. And just because you're mainly coming from a Russian site, and we're hoping that Kazan will be an exciting place where lots of things might change. And I'm also hoping that on June 5th, that is tomorrow, there's an appeal court from the military Supreme Court that has a chance to free Boris Kargolitsky. Watch that space. He's been one of our BRICS from Below contributors, and none of us like to see great intellectuals locked up, no matter what your persuasion is, no matter what they've tweeted about mosque at the counter. So thank you very much.
Could you
Boris
repeat his name?
Yes, his name's Boris Kargolitsky, and he's probably Russia's best known sociologist. Certainly in the Western world, we followed him for decades, and he was locked up by Brezhnev, by Yeltsin, and now by Putin. So we hope he gets out each time with a little more humor and tolerance for the tough conditions. Yeah. So thank you very much. We'll see you again. Cheers.
Okay. Thanks, Patrick. All right. Let me finish off. Thanks, Rhod.
Cheers. Bye.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for tuning into this BRICS Briefs. If you've enjoyed this dive into the multipolar world and wish to join the conversation, please comment below. Please like and share this episode to spread it as far as possible. You can follow us on our Substack and other social media platforms, all linked below. Stay curious, stay connected, stay optimistic, and let's keep exploring together. Ciao.